Hello and welcome everybody back to the channel. This is actually take two. No, you guys won't have been a part of take one, but we're here again with Brandon Phan. We're going to break down some fighting game knowledge and talk about how it relates to historical fencing. And like I said, we've got Brandon Phan here from what's the school that you're part of again?
Yeah, Dallas School of Historical Fencing.
So there are like more than one Dallas schools, and I just didn't want to confuse
Yeah,
you
there's
guys.
there's quite a few. DFW as a metroplex is huge, so we have kind of all walks of HEMA, all varieties of HEMA for
Okay,
sure.
right on. All right. But before we get into it, Brandon, you were just at a historical fencing event. It was local to you, but it was sort of a pretty well attended event
hmm
in Oklahoma, right? So tell us
Yeah,
about that before we get
yeah.
started.
So I was at a Gesslen Fechten 2023. It's a yearly event hosted by some Brogy, really great KDF school that's practicing out of Oklahoma City. As far as participation, there was about, I believe, 115 longsword competitors that weekend, about 65 rapierists, and I think close to 80 plus mixed steel individuals. I was just doing longsword that weekend. I got to second place in Tier A. I was pretty happy about that. Got to meet and greet everybody at a HEMA event. You know how it usually goes, right? You go to one and then you feel like you meet somebody, you never see them again until the next event. It's like your family all over again. But yeah, it was great event. Really well ran tournament, fun rule set, pretty good stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Tell me about the mixed steel.
Yeah,
Like,
for
what was
sure.
what's
Usually,
the
when
way
you
that
when you
they?
think of mixed steel, or I guess when you hear of different weapon systems in HEMA, the tournament structure is usually like there's a Messer tournament, there's a Rapier tournament, there's a
Yeah.
Saber tournament. So Brogy has been running for a while now this idea of sword and companion weapon, what they would just call mixed steel.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, you're not required to have a companion weapon, whether it's like a buckler or a parrying dagger. There's a guy who just rocked a katana this year. There are a lot of solo saberists as well. But the idea is any weapon combination you want, everybody competes. Ideally, the second pool or one of the pools that you do, they put you with like weapons, so maybe solo weapons or a lot of sword and bucklers all hanging out together, or cape and rapiers. There's two pools dedicated
Mhm.
to that this weekend, and then eventually they take it up to elims and finals. And then I
Very
think
very neat.
sword and buckler has great representation. That usually is what ends up being up top.
I mean, it's a really powerful weapon combination, right?
Right.
Like
hmm hmm
you're at a nominal advantage when you're
hmm
fencing someone with one sword,
hmm
when you basically can use your both hands to be your strong and then attack with the other hand. Right?
Right.
That's huge. But yeah, so that sounds interesting. It's interesting the way that they do that to like make sure that they pair people together. Um,
hmm Right.
you know, so like obviously the point of the exercise is to fence people of different weapon systems, right? Like
Right. hmm
that's how it's designed. But it's also cool to kind of measure how you fare in both regards.
Yeah,
And then
for
like
sure.
and then for you, like as a competitor or whatever, obviously you didn't compete, but like for someone who competes, they get to look at that and say, like, okay, I'm
hmm
competent. Maybe I get enough practice against someone who's got a single sword, but maybe I need to put some work in otherwise.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. I think that's one of the things that you don't see as often in HEMA. Oftentimes, when we talk about the weapons that we practice, the assumption is that the person that I'm sparring or competing with is using the same weapon, and then maybe there's
Mm.
some granular differences on like length or weight,
Yeah,
whatever it may be. But worlds apart when you're trying to do something like, let's say, solo messer against somebody with side sword and buckler, and the
yeah,
game changes, and also the familiarity kind of goes out the window for a lot of people.
right, for sure, totally. So I mean, we can already start drawing corollaries to our topic of
hmm
discussion for today.
hmm
But I feel like we spent a huge chunk of time last time we did this talking about just how unfamiliar the majority of people who play fighting games are with
hmm
like what it means to play fighting games conceptually, right? And
hmm
it's not because people are dumb. It's just because most of the time when people buy fighting games, they buy it like any other game that they just want to use to decompress, not take
Right.
seriously, or not get like really involved in understanding the depths of. But I feel like for our conversation, for our continuing conversation, it would be really beneficial for people to get like a real no shit primer on what fighting games are, right? So
Mhm.
not like obviously we all know that fighting games are like these arcade games that came out in the 90s and blah blah blah.
Sure.
But I'm
For
talking
sure.
about like as someone who takes them very seriously, what's the first thing that you want to look for? What's the framework that you apply to your understanding of the game? Um, and then we can kind of build from there, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But just start with that question, right? Someone's brand new to fighting games. Uh, they do want to take it seriously, so it's not just like a something that they use to kind of have fun and goof around. They're
Mhm.
not casuals. They want to take the game seriously, but they've never played fighting games before ever.
Mhm.
So what's the first thing that you tell? What's the first thing that you tell someone like
Yeah. Oh man, great question. So I want to preface that for me, when somebody asks, like, what's the appeal of fighting games? What's difficult about fighting games? And then conceptually, tactically, like, what is it that's going on? The thing that I like to say is that a fighting game is a whole bunch of small games put together in one small space. There's a lot of really small objectives that if you want to, you can break down in a pretty reductive sense. But the difficulty comes in the entirety of all these games put together, and then of course how that interacts with the other person who's also perceiving the game in the same way or trying to play different games. The first thing that I do though when somebody's like, "Hey, I want to get into fighting games. What should I do?" Uh, is try to relate the concepts in as many digestible ways as we can that's familiar to them, analogies if it would be.
that? Okay,
Thinking of
nice.
things like, when we talk about footsies and fighting games or whiff punishing or anything like that, and then you show that concept to somebody, but if you show it to them in a video game or especially in a fighting game, they don't have maybe that context historically because they're totally new to the series. But show
Hmm.
them something like Dark Souls, right, or another game that they played, Legend of Zelda, and the concepts of like whiff punishing or blocking, it all exists in some form of fashion, right? The flavor might look a little bit different, but thematically it's the same. So that's a huge
Yeah.
part for me, is making those correlations. What do they play right now? They play League of Legends. Let's explain footsies through this idea of poking and counter poking. If they play, old school like side scroll beat 'em ups, right? This idea of footsies is pretty familiar because it's innately into the game, whatever it may be. That's my
Right. Right. Right.
perspective. Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So, so let's say now, so now, like you've related it to them, you start playing, and you realize that they're doing things that are unsafe, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so like we know what that means,
Right.
and you know maybe they might understand like what's happening.
Right.
But if you're gonna like actually sit down and say like, all right, this is what it means to be unsafe. This is
Mhm.
this is the right kind of move to throw out, and this is the wrong kind of move. How would you approach that topic?
Yeah, so as somebody who's tried so hard to get friends into fighting games, there's almost a spiel. Like you get so used to being like, "Oh, this is like frame data for dummies. This is whatever it may be." So when I think of like objectively getting somebody into the game, making them have fun is one of the most important things. So
Yeah.
give them a framework in which they can learn in an environment that doesn't feel like studying. Because realistically, if you want to get good at fighting games, let's say at a really competitive level, there is a lot of self study, or like you have to hunt for information. You have to look on YouTube for setups, whatever it may be. But as far as when I'm explaining what these buttons do, I think really, really broadly, this idea of like, oh, like your light buttons are really quick, right? They're really quick and they're really safe, or they recover quickly. And then, of course, the heavier buttons do more damage, and they're out there longer, so you're likely that you can get punished if something doesn't happen. And then for me, I think we talked about this before, but a way that I like to kind of more speed up the process of them understanding it is giving them really diluted game plans and playing with them a diluted version of a fighting game. I think
Uh-huh.
we've talked about this before, a sweeper throw,
Sweep
right?
throw.
Like I
Yeah.
play sweeper throw as a way to teach about throw teching, when you building up the sense of when you should be teching a throw, when you should be throwing, and then sweeping to keep them in check. And then inversely, I've done this before where it's like, let's play jab fighter, right? And it's
Okay.
super boring. But now let's add like crouching medium kick, and now everything kind of starts to slowly become more like a fighting game. But
Right. Right. Right.
uh,
Right.
there are a lot of moments where at some point you have to get down to, they understand the game, but do they
You-
understand why it works?
yeah. You have to
Let's
say
talk.
numbers.
Let's talk about the math. Yeah, the math for
Right.
sure. And that's been the challenge of fighting games, right? Is how do you teach the math in a not boring way?
It's so funny because when I was a kid, I remember like I was a kid probably a little longer ago when you were a kid. And so when I was learning fighting games, no one knew anything about frame data. Like
Right.
some people who were actually playing at the highest level back then might have had a rudimentary understanding of frame data, but you just sort of got a feel for things. And when people started introducing frame data to the equation, it almost felt like a weird, like a cheat code or like a meta game that you weren't actually playing. Like the point of the fighting game is to sort of live vicariously through this sprite, on the screen in front of you, and you don't want to think about like I want to throw punches. I don't want to throw buttons with recovery frames and startup frames and active frames. You know what I'm saying? And so like for me, definitely, like you say, or like eventually you do have to get into the math. But even if we just start by saying like, okay, that leaves you totally safe. That you get to keep your turn after this. That leaves you semi-safe, which is like there is a punish window, but it's pretty marginal. Or like that's really unsafe. Like you're gonna like those ideas, right? So if we're talking about that, so break that down for me the way that you would. So you've got something that you get to keep your turn, something that leaves you safe, something that mostly leaves you safe, or something that leaves you unsafe. How would you break those four things down?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that when we look at like a lot of the language and expression of playing the game in a fighting game, ultimately almost every fighting game will come down to this idea of turns. Whose turn is it? And this isn't even exclusive to a fighting game. You can look to other, popular games. Again, we can make an analogy to like an action RPG like Dark Souls or Skyrim, where this turn system is kind of baked in. But I think in fighting games, it's been like objectively like correlated with how you should be perceiving the game itself. Not that unfamiliar to fencing in a lot of ways, but besides the point. When I think of like this idea of whose turn it is, it's something that you have to buy into, right? Both people kind of have to be a portion of it in some way for that game to be mutually played. Not to say that you have to totally ignore it, but oftentimes new players won't be thinking of the game in this manner. But this idea of what we would say plus on block, right? Or it means that it's still your turn, which means that essentially maybe you've done an action which objectively the game allows you to move before your opponent. So by risk reward, by a really utilitarian sense, you have the advantage, right? Inversely, you have like minus but not punishable, right? So it's not technically your turn, but you can't be punished for the action itself, but it behooves you to probably not do anything because you get in trouble. If we were to think of rock, paper, scissors, you have three different options. None of the options outside of just standing still and blocking would cover it, right? So that would be something where you're unsafe on block but not punishable. Punishable by block is what we always want to avoid, almost, right? We don't want to do anything in which we're so negative that we get punished for the action itself. And even in fighting game terms, they're usually really high risk, really high reward actions, whether it's a dragon punch motion, wake up super, wake up ultra, anything like that.
So I want to jump in there for a moment. So that I think when they're done at a high level, they're normally really high risk, really high reward. But often it's possible for it to be really high risk and really low reward, or virtually no reward, right? And like it's not, that's actually part of at the higher level. That's part of the metagame, right? It's like okay, I know that I'm going to have to take risk. Right, because if we both played the game perfectly according to the frame data, then neither of us would ever do anything that left us unsafe.
Yes, right.
And so we have to accept some risk, but we accept risk on the basis of the circumstances around what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. The metagame itself, and I think there's a few players who are really well known for this, right? Like in Japan, Kazunoko, a really famous Yun player in Street Fighter 4. Who was super well known for full screen move on a high level just working, where people would talk about the Daigo uppercut, like this mind reading uppercut where it's obviously such a high risk. And sometimes the reward's not that big outside of the mental gain of their opponent knowing that they're going to take that risk. Or even to modern day Street Fighter 5, I think, what's his name, who's been doing really, really well? Idom. Idom does such a great job. And in a game like Street Fighter 6, where, doing a backdash isn't invincible anymore, why does Idom get away with backdash, wake up backdash in the corner, right? So it plays around these presumptions that we make on a high level, of course. if everybody plays correctly is the term that we use. And then we have like really clean fighting game play.
Right.
But usually what ends up happening is that you have to play incorrectly in many moments of time to keep everybody honest, because oftentimes those who are exploitative, right, doing wake up dragon punches or in between block strings jabbing, it's a tactic that is objectively unsafe and high risk, but it has to be done at some point in time to make the meta, make the game more full.
Right. So talking about correctly, and the one that, basically the one iron law of fighting games that you basically make clear with regards to this topic is you never want to leave yourself punishable on block, right? Like you never want to throw out an attack that your opponent objectively gets a free combo, free hit, whatever the punish is. Maybe it's maybe it's a small punish, maybe it's a full combo, but like it's never worth the risk of leaving yourself negative caveats.
Absolutely right.
So break that down. Like what exactly is happening? You throw out a button, leaves you punishable on block. What's actually happening there?
Yeah. So what happens with the math in the fighting game itself is you throw out a button, let's say it gets blocked and it leaves you punishable. The math of the game would determine, and we could talk about startup, active, and recovery at some point in time.
We do that now. Let's do that now.
Yeah, for sure. So if we were to break down any fighting game action, it doesn't even have to be like an attack. It could be like a parry, it could be a jumping action, it could be anything, or a grab. There's 3 phases of that action itself, what we define as the startup, which would be the very beginning of the action, and then the second part being the active frames, which is from the startup to when the action itself is considered active, what we'd call a hitbox gets put out in place. In a fighting game, not everybody's limbs are always hitting somebody. If you walk into each other, no one's getting hit or no one's taking damage. But pressing the button, like the fist coming out, when the fist is at extension and when the game decides that it should be hitting, that's an active frame, or when it's considered active. And then recovery is essentially when that move is getting back to the default state, or the movable state, right? So the example that you always see is that if you imagine somebody throwing out a punch, right, the pulling of the punch itself, reaching out, would be what we consider the startup frame. When the punch is at that full destination or extension, we could consider that the active portion. And then as we're pulling that arm backwards, we would call that the recovery. And so when we talk about this idea of when you block a move that leaves you punishable, the assumption is usually if I were to hit them and they blocked, they would only have, let's hypothetically say, 12 frames out of a second, 60 frames a second. They have 12 frames where they have to be blocking and they're stuck in block animation. But I have, let's say, 40 frames where I have to be recovering myself. If we do the math, 40 minus 12, that leaves them with about, 28 frames where they can do whatever they want. They can hit me, they can grab me, they can dance around. And I can't do anything because I'm stuck in a phase, a game state, essentially. Mm-hmm.
Right. So like, and the reason that I want to spend time with this is because I feel like, and as we start to like really draw correlation between the conceptual framework of fighting games and the conceptual framework of fencing, particularly the school of fencing that I'm a student of, and that you are likewise a student of, the KDF school, they have ideas that are very, very similar. And so one of the ways that we might think about indes, right? Like the idea of performing. Now, there are lots of ways that we can think about indes and fueling and how we sort of think about it metaphysically. But if we try and take as like scientific an approach to, it's something akin to the way that fighting games work with frame data, right? An action that can happen indes, right, might be akin to you throwing out, so us being at a particular range, right? You throwing out a button that has a ton of startup frames, right? In fact, it has so many startup frames that I can actually perceive what the button is and perform an action. And if we're at some range, some predetermined range where my button can be active before you're, this is possible, right? So like I can interrupt, right? So that's what we call an interruption, right? In fighting game. So this happens in swordsmanship, right? If
Mhm.
someone withdraws their sword in this, this huge way, and my sword is to bear, right? I'm present in the bind, and my
Mhm.
training partner withdraws their sword. I'm able to perceive that withdrawal, launch my attack, and actually hit in the what we might call the startup frames of that animation, right?
Right. Mhm.
And so like I really feel like, you know, uh, there's value in just like I want to go back to when I was a kid and how we didn't want to do math. It was weird. Like we felt like you were unpure. Like a pure fighting game player doesn't do the frame data.
Play
They
with their
go
heart.
based on,
Yeah, they
yeah,
play
play
with
with
their
your
heart.
heart, and
Yeah,
then
sure. That's how it goes. Yeah.
right. And it's like, and it's so funny because like, are you going to do that with weightlifting? Right. Like,
Right. 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 Right.
no, you're going to hurt yourself. So like
Right.
you obviously know that you need to study. But anyway, so, okay. So we have interruptions and then we have punishes. But I talked about interruptions. You were talking about punishes. So like,
Mhm.
so, so then how might we draw a correlation? So, so we might say in fencing,
Mhm.
given a blade configuration,
Mhm.
there's um, there are actions that you can perform that leave you unsafe on in the startup frames, right? Like so, leave you unsafe to be interrupted,
Mhm.
or actions that leave you unsafe on block,
Mhm.
right? Does that make
Mhm.
sense? Do you
Yeah.
follow?
For sure.
Um, and so, like now, there's also other actions that sort of leave you they give up your turn,
Yes.
right? Is
Mhm.
that so what happens when you give up your turn? What's the back and forth then, right? So like we know that when someone throws out a button, depending on how the person responds, they might block or the button might whiff, and then this turn is passed back and forth. But what's the back and forth between the players? Like how are they approaching now, sort of at a higher level, thinking tactically about all of this? How do you try and do well in this game?
Right. So I think this is a great question too that we can relate back to fencing. But to kind of answer the tactical framework on a higher level of a fighting game, we understand and we've established this idea of like turns and turn structure. Let's say that two players who are familiar with the frame data. Anytime they see a move in their matrix brain, a number pops up and they immediately know, oh, it's is it my turn or is it not my turn? The question is, if we always abide by the turn structure, and then it would become a really binary game. Like things
Mhm.
would be solvable, but oftentimes, a state in fighting games, which is interesting, is the nebulous position of something that's negative on block but not punishable. Because a
Mhm.
balance point of the games is that there's oftentimes a tool that is meant to be done that could be invincible on startup or give you armor on startup or some type of mechanism. This effectively means that if we played in a really binary way where everything was either punishable or not punishable, we would always make kind of relatively correct decisions because the decision tree is really easy to kind of grasp if you knew the frame data, if you knew the game, if you knew the characters. But by having these options in which essentially we have to guess would our opponent do this, the invincible move when they're negative on block, um, block something, do a DP, whiff a button, do a DP, or will they respect the turn structure and not take the risk and block instead, right? In fencing, I think this is interesting, right? Because that structure is a little bit different. I think even looking at things like active, like in a fighting game, you don't normally have a limb that's always active, but a sword can always be active in a sense, right? But this
Mhm.
idea of we do share the similarity between fighting games and fencing, where there's things that are plus on block, where you have the advantage, right? There's things that leave you punishable on whiff is a good example, right? Recovery frames really high, but we also have like a nebulous space sometimes too,
Mhm.
where we have to kind of look at this nebulous space where my opponent should do something. They should respect my point or they should respect the threat, but I have to remember that they could also decide not to, right?
Mhm.
And that's
Yeah.
shared in fighting games. The difference between the two is that in fencing, and if we look at maybe the context of swordsmanship or maybe the context of the weapons, the risk of doing something and getting hit is awfully bit higher than your character
Well,
usually.
right, yeah, because when it comes down to fencing, we're not, it's not like the difference between a light punish or a full combo. It's like,
Exactly, right.
every hit is a hit,
Everything.
you know,
Hmm.
that's a touch, right? So
Hmm.
now, would you now let's go to fencing for a second, right?
Mhm.
Or actually, let's just talk about fighting games. So, would you encourage new players to learn all the rules? Like, I know that you've said like we're going to play this limited version of the game, right? But let's say someone wants to really get serious into like playing
Right.
that.
Mhm.
Would you encourage them to learn the frame data on every button and
Mm.
or
Mhm.
or would you sort of try and limit that to the buttons that account for the highest degree of variation and maybe give
Mhm.
them a strong sense of positions of advantage, like things that leave them safe and unsafe? How would you approach that within a fighting game?
Yeah. So this is great. So I want to say first, I'll talk to the numerical sense, the numbers, the frame data, and like tactically, how do we approach frame data on different skill levels? But also, I'll make a comment based off of just the overall arching like game plan and how that changes so dramatically with skill level, which I'm sure we've talked about previously too. But let me get to the frame data stuff. So I like for newer people to think of things really, really broadly and conceptually. So, for example, they have on a traditional 6 button fighter, you have light, medium, heavy punch, light, medium, heavy kick. You can have any combination of command normals. You can have any combination of jumping or crouching. This idea of for you to play well, you have to learn all the frame data, I don't think is necessarily true. But I do think you need to be very familiar with which button gives you the role or the outcome that you need. So, for
Mhm.
example, if somebody's really close to you and they're really new, I would tell them, hey, you can block or you can crouching jab. It's your fastest, safest button. On blocking, leave you +1, whatever it may be. Or if they're far away, crouching medium kick or standing medium kick, whatever it may be, is like just worry about that button. If they're jumping at you, don't worry about all the variations of the anti-air. Just find the button with the hitbox that points up. Crouching heavy punch, right?
Right.
For the frame data of it, I don't necessarily like say like, hey, you should start learning that until they're like, if we're looking at like a rating system for fighting games, until they're like at least maybe silver or gold, because it doesn't really matter necessarily. And the reason why is that they're not going to internalize it, or other people aren't even playing by the same rules, so the game becomes a little bit more difficult for them to grasp too. Or as far as like an objective, I want you guys to get good at the game. This is going to the position of on a lower level, people are playing entirely different games than anybody else, right? They're not playing by
Yeah.
frame data. Everybody's playing with the heart, and they all have weird perceptions of how they should be moving. It's almost the
Right.
same as fencing too. Some people they
Well,
don't play by the rules.
yeah.
And it's if you teach them the frame data and you teach them this idea of, hey, let's adhere, let's research, what ends up happening because there's that nebulous middle space of negative but not punishable is you build this perception of how they should be playing for
Right.
themselves. And maybe that's true on like a higher level when everybody like understands the complexity of the meta and the conclusion
Mhm.
of this is how we should be playing. But oftentimes I think of that UK Street Fighter 4 tournament where Gandhi was a Ryu player. He was a casual Ryu player, typical like Ryu flowchart guy, beat the guy who was expected to win the tournament in pools. Funny match. The guy's getting super mad because he's getting hit by wake up DP every time. And the reason why, and the commentators say, is because he kept expecting him to play by the rules, but he just wouldn't.
Right.
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 So I think kind of framing the skill level that you're looking at and then being like, hey, this is how you beat that game. This is how you beat that skill level. And then
Sure.
eventually the conclusion is, hey, everybody's done the thing to beat that skill level. They're now in platinum or diamond, whatever it may be.
Right.
So ideally, everybody's now kind of looking at a more homogenous or conceptual way to play correctly. And
Yeah.
then the perception is we teach them that perspective. We teach them how to play correctly. And then at the highest level, you find moments where you bring everything together and you break it down, right? You establish the meta, you break the meta, you break the rules. Mhm.
So okay, so let's talk about noobs getting into matches. They're
Mhm.
they're we'll say they're silver players, right?
Yeah, sure.
Um, they're and it's funny. I don't know how much you follow the various things on YouTube, but Anime
Mhm.
Illuminati. I don't know if you know
Yeah,
Gentleman's YouTube
yeah, yeah,
channel.
yeah.
He made a video of how you beat or like 6 tips for silver players, and he basically just recommended like the scrubbiest stuff,
Yeah.
like legit, like stuff that's like was incorrect,
Mhm.
um, uh, according to the discussion that we're having.
Yeah.
And I was like, it actually took me aback because normally when someone gives you advice on how to start your journey in fighting games, it's like throw out safe buttons,
Yeah.
Learn to anti-air.
Yeah.
It's not do the scrubby shit that beats like the
Yeah.
the
It's
six
not it's
basic
not
rules.
pick Blanca and roll your face on the controller, even though you know
That's
that's what you're not supposed to do, but it's gonna win. What are they gonna
it's
do
gonna
about it?
well, and
Yeah.
that's the thing is like it's 6 tips for I think it was bronze or whatever, but right, it's like
Mhm.
6 tips for that's gonna win in bronze.
Yeah.
So that was kind of funny. But let's say for you, you're maybe not bronze, maybe silver, maybe gold. Like
Sure.
new fighting player really wants to start playing correctly or introduce these ideas.
Mhm.
Learn to anti-air. We'll use that as a starting point, right? What
Mhm.
are some other things that you're telling this
Yeah,
new?
so learn your punish button. So learn your quick punish button or your quick punish
Okay,
route.
let's talk about
As a
that. All
Yeah,
right.
for
So
sure.
what do you mean punish button, right? Like we established that I could leave myself unsafe,
Mhm.
punishable,
Mhm.
and then you are saying that you have a choice with how you respond.
Yeah, for sure. So to the idea of if we look at these skill levels, one way that you can look at fighting games on a low level, and this is what I say to a lot of people who are a lot of friends that I have who are trying to play. I watch them play ranked, and it's just hey, just hang out and be safe until they mess up, until they do something that you can punish, like objectively
Mhm.
by the game system. Depending on what that is, if it's a button that is only punishable within 3 or 4 frames, or a relatively safe but not totally safe button, you can't do the big button that you want to do, the big punch that you want to do, because the game math won't allow you. So you need to find something that is quick and efficient. Maybe it's like a punish that starts with a light button as opposed to like a medium or heavy button, which means you're trading off damage for quickness. And then inversely, if somebody does something really, really unsafe, you can find a bigger full damage punish, which usually means it uses more of your resources, or the starter of the combo or the starter of the punish requires a setup of more time. Mhm.
Right. Yeah, and so that's one thing that we're not going to get too heavy into today, but like the
Mhm.
idea that with combos, the way the combos work are you can't just do the 60% combo whenever you want,
Right.
right?
Right, right.
Like you have to, because normally the 60% combo starts with an action that requires a ton of startup frames,
Yeah.
that it would be hard to take advantage of someone who leaves himself just barely punishable, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Um, and so instead, you have to have a few different ways to take advantage of people who leave themselves unsafe. Right?
Yes.
One way might be thrust them in the face because that's how
Right.
unsafe they've left themselves.
Yep.
Another way might be tag the hands
Yep.
because they've only barely left themselves unsafe. Right?
Yep. Hmm.
Um, okay, so learn your punishes, which
Hmm.
means, and you're saying how many punishes would you have
I
them
would
learn?
usually tell newer players, if they have like a grasp of the game mechanics, learn one really quick punish, one easy punish with an easy combo route, and then learn one big punish, whatever it may
Okay,
be. Mhm.
right, like so,
Like
like
stun combo versus like throw punish, whatever it is.
right. Something that starts with like a 4 frame, or
Yeah.
in Street Fighter 6, a 4 frame button versus
Hmm.
something that starts with heavy punch or whatever.
Right. Right. Right.
Okay. So then, all right. So we got anti-air. Learn your punishes, basic
Mhm.
punishes, advanced punishes. Go ahead.
Mhm. The
What's
other thing
next?
that I would say is, and it happens naturally, but is learn when you should be throwing and teching. And this is like a feeling thing that usually players
Uh,
get to at some point in time. Give a new player, a new fighting game player, like a controller, and be like, hey, like what are the odds they can tech even 1 out of 10 throws? Like it's
mhm.
because the opportunity that they should be getting thrown or shouldn't be getting thrown just isn't there. But as you get to something like silver or gold, everybody realizes, oh well, if new players aren't throwing, if I just keep throwing people, I'll be successful. But that reaches only so far because now everybody's been throwing everybody. So
Right.
building the innate knowledge of hey, when should I be expecting the throw is also another thing that I think is pretty important to teach somebody.
So you'll forgive me because I don't remember whether or not or to what degree we covered this in the last discussion.
Mhm.
But there's this rocks paper scissors, right? And
Yes.
there's throw, and there's
Mhm.
hit, and then there's block, right? Those
Mhm.
are the three. Those are the three rocks paper scissors options of
Yeah.
Street Fighter, and it's a little bit more sophisticated than that in
Sure.
practice when you're depending on the game and the system mechanics or whatever.
Mhm.
But the idea is like so we've introduced this idea of turns, right?
Mhm.
Because you have advantage, you have frame advantage, and
Mhm.
so nominally we'll leave the meta game out of it, right?
Mhm.
Nominally it's your turn, And
Mhm.
so you can proceed with your turn one of, well, we'll say, I mean, I guess you have two options really, right?
Mhm.
You can either throw or you
Mhm.
can hit, right? You can throw
Mhm.
out a button or you can try and grab. Um, and so what, and then so my options as the defensive player is I can either assume you're going to throw
Mhm.
or, or I could assume that you're going to hit. If I assume that you're going to hit, then my goal should be to block. I could there we talked about invincible, like
Sure.
there are some options that you have other than that, but we just talking about
Mhm.
the basic rock paper scissors. My goal
Mhm.
should be to block. And well, I guess we probably should introduce the invincible reversal too, right? Because
Yeah, that'd be a good idea.
that's
It can
integral
be a
to
pretty
the
big part, yeah, to the game.
right. So go ahead.
Yeah. So when we look at these ideas of invincible moves, we have breaking down the structure of the moves again really quickly, we have startup, active, and then recovery, right? Generally speaking, during the startup of a move, you can get hit out of it in a fighting game. You can't block during that because you're dedicated to the action. And same thing with recovery. You can't block during recovery or even the active frames. You're dedicated to that game state. What we would call a invincible move is essentially a move in which you are invulnerable or invincible during the startup of the move itself. So if a big punch had 5/60th of a second where it's starting up, 2/60th of a second where it's considered active, and then 3/60th of a second where it's recovering, that five in the beginning, you cannot be hit at all. It's not that you can block per se, but it's that any move that comes towards you just phases through your body.
Right.
And for the sake of this rock paper scissors, like if I'm in a position where I'm guessing that my opponent's either going to strike me or throw me, um, blocking covers strike, throwing back covers the throw option itself, but the magic option that covers both could be the invincible button because I can't be thrown out of the invincible button,
Right.
neither can I be struck during the invincible button.
Right. So I think this is actually super important, right? Because then it gets to sort of it isn't as simple as just rocks paper scissors, right?
Right. Hmm.
So it's a rocks paper scissors where one option covers the other two,
Right.
and so the guess is really what option is he not covering, right?
Yes.
That's what we end up with,
Yes,
right?
for sure.
So then how do I? Well, so then what? So okay, and I think we have to talk about meaties too, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for
In
sure.
the well, and it's just like I'm sorry, people, but we have to do this. You have to learn
Yeah,
how to
it's a
play
lot.
fighting games.
You might as well just play fighting games at this point.
So, but no, but listen, right? So,
Mhm.
so let's say I know that you're gonna. Let's say I know you're gonna hit. Well, you're leaving yourself vulnerable when you're gonna strike. You're leaving
Mhm.
yourself vulnerable in those startup frames. So, why can't I just mash jab?
Yeah, it's a good question. So oftentimes, if I've lost my turn, which is to say in game math that I'm at negative frames when my opponent has frames where they can be doing action, what we'd call a meaty, as James said earlier, is a term that refers to essentially if my character is knocked down, they can't be hit on the ground with a few exceptions, but as they're getting back up, there is a moment in time in which the character is now considered hittable, which means that they can instantly block during that moment. If we think of frame data as, again, like pieces of a pie, I can time a move so that as my opponent gets up off the ground and is able to block, they are getting up into the active frames of my move itself. This means that if they try pressing a button, your button isn't instantaneous. It would still take 3 or 4 frames to get out with the active portion, which means that what we would call this meaty move, this move that hit you while it's active as you're getting up, would immediately stuff out and hit you on frame one, which
Right.
no move in a fighting game oftentimes, unless you're playing a cursed fighting game like Marvel vs. Capcom 3, is active frame one or,
Right.
invincible, whatever it may be.
So right, and so this is important because we have to assume if we're looking at this rocks paper scissors, theoretically, we
Yeah.
have to assume that the strike that we're contending with is going to be a meaty strike, right? It's
Right.
not something that we can trade with. It's not something that we can just hit a light button that leaves us safe on block, right?
Right.
It's got to be something that regardless of what we leave ourselves active with, we're going to get hit in those frames
Yeah.
unless those startup frames are invincible.
Invincible in some way.
Right. And so now then what are your so what my options really become are I can either block, I can try and tech the throw,
Hmm.
um, or I can invincible reversal.
Hmm.
And those and again we can delay stuff and create more
Sure.
sophisticated things. But
Yeah.
now we find ourselves in that place where the options that I'm using cover two of your options. And
Yeah.
then your options are what? So your
As
options
the
are
attacker.
now as the
Yeah, so
attacker.
as the attacker, so if we've situated that they can block, they can tech, they can do an invincible, kind of the options as the attacker is that a meaty covers blocking and it covers teching and it covers hitting under most circumstances outside of invincible. If my opponent blocks a meaty attack because they've been hit during the first frame of my active or their first frame, by the game math, and again, this is kind of going into some stuff, I'm technically most likely more plus than I am minus. Even
Mhm.
if the move traditionally, if they were to block it, would have left me negative on block. If they've
Right.
blocked it and I've made it meaty, it could leave me +1, +2. So I continue to have my turn. If they get hit by the meaty, it gives me a combo. If they get hit when they're trying to tech a throw, they can't really tech a throw as they're getting hit by a meaty because they're getting hit during the startup frames of their throw itself. The If I think that they're going to do some type of invincible or invulnerable or armored move, my option is usually to block because in the case of an invincible move, the payoff or the thing that we're sacrificing is that move is so good during the active frames that the recovery frames are probably a lot to balance it out. So if I
Right.
just sit there and block and let them do the invincible thing, and then I've let them make their own mistake. And then this would give me probably an opportunity to do what we call a big punish, right? A big
Right.
damage combo because we have all the time in the world to set it up.
Right.
Or if we think that they're throwing, which would go into strike throw mix-ups, and probably something we can talk about some other point in time. My option is to sit there and block, or even take a step backwards. Taking a step backwards, specifically in this case, would cover the invincible action because they miss, but it would also cover the throw action in which they miss as well, both
Right.
resulting in me getting to punish them because of the recovery frames affiliated with both.
Right. Because if
Hmm.
you step back out of their throw range, then they're going to whiff their throw, and that's going to leave them super negative because they're
Yeah.
going to
Hmm.
recover information of their throw, and
Absolutely.
you're not going to have, they're not going to have tech to you, they're not going to have touched you, so you're still, uh,
Yes.
right. Okay, so we've talked about offense, we've talked about defense, and we
Hmm.
talked about what it means to press a button, right?
Hmm.
So now let's get into, and this is sort of this is like the tricky part, right? Because we're kind of the way that we've set this up, we haven't introduced like all the bullshit, right? All
Right.
the
Right. All the connective tissue. Right. For
well,
sure.
when I'm talking about like especially like
Oh, the
all
all the
the
fighting game bullshit. Yeah, for sure.
yeah.
All the asterisks to everything. Yeah.
Right. So but I want to keep, I feel like a smart assumption for me. And the reason that I make this assumption is it's similar to the way that I approach fencing, right? If
Hmm.
I'm teaching a new person fencing, I could teach them like, you know, yeah, you should double feint, right? Because they're going to bite on one of them, and then you've got a 50% chance of hitting,
Yeah.
and they're not going to take their offense back because they're going to be stuck in this mind game of like,
Yeah.
where's it going to hit, right? But when I'm teaching a new student fencing, I like to start with like, this is what it means to have advantage, right? So
Hmm.
before we do anything else, I want to show you what type of blade configuration it looks like. Um, that leaves you super plus and your training partner super negative,
Hmm.
right? And then I'm going to show you how you can proceed with your turn. I'm going to show you a few buttons that you
Right.
can press that give you some good offense, give you some good pressure, and basically leave you safe the whole time,
Hmm.
right? Um, so, and we can introduce all of the caveats and all of the chaos of
Hmm.
various ways that but this accounts for the majority of the variation, right?
Right.
Now, obviously, fighting games, they would be, I don't know. I think you mentioned that you're like a grounded footsie fighting game guy. Like
Yeah.
that's,
I'm a Street Fighter player. I want
you're a Street
honest.
Fighter player.
It's not always true in the recent months, but I want it to be as honest as I can go.
Right. With punishing, buffering specials like
Right.
this is,
Yeah.
so let's talk about that, right? What does it mean then to play neutral given that, right? Never forget all the forget all the various ways that you can get in or play keep away or zone or do whatever. Like we assume that we're just playing footsies.
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like in terms of what we've discussed so far?
Yeah, so playing footsies is an interesting phase that's usually central to fighting games because you start relatively far away. You don't start in this distance where you're automatically hitting each other. I do want to make kind of the note that even in a game like Street Fighter, which is historically considered like a more grounded based footsies fighting game, when you compare it to something like we'd call an anime fighter, Guilty Gear or BlazBlue, where everything's a bit more off the wall, the average power level is a bit higher, offense is a bit stronger. I think that it's worth noting that for me, especially in Street Fighter and in the more modern games interpretation, footsies is only a means to the end, and the means is the footsies, the hitting them, the whiff punishing, whatever. Maybe I'll talk that in a second. But the end is okizemi, right? Is pressure, is vor oriented offense,
Yeah.
as the KDF says, hit him with a tag hit, then continue in to finish the action. It's the same thing. Hit him with a whiff punish, get the oki, do the throw, put him in a mix up, whatever it may be. But if we're looking specifically at footsies, or what we'd call footsies, ground-based neutral, the game that we're playing in reference to this idea of offense, defense, and turn taking is efficiency of action and efficiency of buttons. So we have startup, we have active, we have recovery. What would a good footsie button look like? It's a button in which it's relatively quick. So the startup is relatively, short. It's active for a long time, makes for a really good footsie button. And then the recovery is ideally a bit shorter, but even if it's longer, the kind of fourth element in footsies is length. How long is the button? If the button is long enough, it can technically be punishable on block, but if I've spaced it correctly, it can no longer be punished by any action my opponent can do.
Right.
The game that we're playing around this idea of
There's
length.
also so
Go
when
ahead.
you said length, I thought you were going to go a different direction, which is like super esoteric and not maybe
Oh,
not
sure. What were
relevant,
you
but
thinking?
like the length of the animation,
Oh, yeah,
right?
for sure
So
too.
like
The
so,
readability
but
of it too. Things like
yeah,
that,
right.
for
So it
sure.
might leave you punishable, but because the animation is so small, it's like not functionally punishable because
Exactly,
you don't even
exactly.
get to catch you don't even get
Mhm.
to catch your negative frames.
You
But
see
anyway,
this a lot too in like light normals and footsies. The recovery might not even be more than 1 or 2 frames different from like a medium button, but the fact that it looks different is especially when we're looking for something even like a frame or two longer, where the animation is close to idle, it can really mess up the game plan itself. But when
right,
we're looking at the kind of these ideas of length, active, startup, and recovery, the game that you play in footsies is how can I hit my opponent at a range or play at a range in which I can hit my opponent and they can't hit me. Efficiency is the most important part of footsies because if I press a button and I miss, my recovery frames ultimately become like really, really bad because my leg that's sticking out can now be hit. It can be counter swept, it can be whiff punished. But if I make them block my move, oftentimes if I space it well enough, that button probably isn't punishable on block. And it's even if it is negative on block, if it's far away enough, it can be like a tempo trap, is what we can consider it in fencing, or it can be
right,
like it tricks on the press a button that I can whiff punish in return. A lot of the game
right.
buttons are designed around this idea.
Yeah. So
Mhm.
that's a really smart way to sort of get into this, right? It's just like spacing traps, right? Like
Yeah,
I can throw out a button and it leaves me negative, but your answer to it isn't long enough to hit. So
yeah,
like what you would try and punish with, the only thing that maybe you could punish with, theoretically, isn't there for you because I've hit it just at the right range. And so when you try and throw that button out, now all of a sudden you're the
hmm
one who's whiffing, and I get to take not only do I get to take my turn back, but I get a guaranteed punishment
yeah,
potentially, right? Depending on how
absolutely.
I set up my spacing trap.
Hmm.
Um, okay, so we're doing this back and forth where we're
Hmm.
where we're throwing out buttons, and
Hmm.
I guess one of the rules, one of the general rules of footsies is like don't throw out a button that's gonna whiff, right? Don't whiff buttons.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
of course, we already talked about there are
There could
ways,
be some higher level trap to it, but 90% of the time you want to try to make sure the buttons that you press would be reaching.
right? And so then the corollary of that is
Hmm.
make your opponent whiff buttons.
Yeah, absolutely, for
So
sure.
how do you do that?
Yeah, so in a fighting game, it's about knowing the range that you and your opponent want to play. That means what is your best footsie button or best range button? What is your opponent's best range button? And then maybe you look at the habits of what they've been pressing to get an idea of what they want to do. The difference being maybe they want to do a really non-committal button that's safe for them. So they'll do standing light kick to check a button versus if they want to go Hail Mary and sweep something and get the Oki. But the way that we play around it, so if we stand still, one character is going to have an advantage. One character is going to have the better button.
Mhm.
Dalsum's a great example, right? Dalsum's a character with super stretchy limbs, and if you just stand there all day, Dalsum's going to hit you from full screen. The way that you play around that is you have to make them whiff, which oftentimes mean these small micro adjustments to movement. Right? If you ever look at high level Street Fighter play on like pro levels, when you see them play footsies, it's always this like tiny like keeping space type of thing or edging in and out of the actual
Mhm.
striking distance. Oftentimes, it's not even the button that we're looking for when we're playing these games to give us the signal to press and hit them, but it could also be is their character moving forward or backwards, right? So the manipulation of space is a huge part on keeping the objective of footsies, which could be don't miss my button so I get closer to make sure that I hit them, or back away from my opponent to make sure that they're whiffing the button too. So as far as
Mhm.
like the if the value is efficiency, the criteria to achieve that efficiency is movement, right? It's a
Right.
huge part of it. Different games to different extents, like Tekken, a game where movement's very difficult. High level perception of gameplay is footsies and movement because footsies isn't accessed as easily because you need to be really good at being able to Korean backdash or whatever, or a game
Mhm.
like Street Fighter where the movement's a little bit easier, so the game can be a little bit more understandable. But all in all, every fighting game shares that aspect of movement being so important to manipulate range and make the game plan more efficient.
Right, right, right. So you have a sense. I think one key aspect of what you're describing here is like I can't really play footsies until I have a sense of what you're doing, right?
Yeah,
Like what your game plan is, what kind of buttons you like to throw out, what
absolutely.
range you tend to throw them out at.
Hmm.
Um, you know, and then I probably I probably need to have a sense of what's safe, what's safe and what's not safe, what kind of risks. And all of the time as we're playing, I'm getting a feel for that, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm learning you, right?
Hmm.
But it doesn't work if I don't know the moves that you're doing, right?
Right.
Like if it's just
Absolutely.
chaos to me,
Hmm.
um, then I don't really get to participate in this higher level
Right.
gameplay.
Hmm.
Uh, so okay, so let's say so real quick, um, talking about footsies opening you up to a full combo,
Hmm.
right? Like potentially giving you Oki, right?
Hmm.
Um, Generally speaking, if I just whiff punish you, I'm probably not going to get Oki, right?
Sure.
Um, if I just like
Sure.
I probably need to
Just press the
whiff
button.
punish.
Maybe need to cancel it to a special or whatever it may be, but if I just press the button.
So let's talk about hit confirming because I feel like this is also like of the relevant topics to how I want to proceed with integrating this framework into
Hmm.
fencing. I feel like hit confirming is a huge part of that, right? Because and I'm gonna take it back to fencing in competition, we'll say, or
Hmm.
just in practice. What I see very often, the videos people share, is people are throwing out full combos. Uh,
Hmm.
and those combos leave them unsafe, right?
Hmm.
Maybe the first button that they throw out in their full combo would have
Hmm.
left them, it maybe give up their turn, but
Yeah.
where they end up is totally unsafe,
Yeah.
and they're just relying on the opponent's lack of preparation to deal with that action
Right.
to keep them fencing well, right?
Hmm.
Or to keep their point totals going up.
Yeah.
So like, what are you doing? What are you doing when you're whiff punishing? And like, so let's say we'll talk about the new because we used to be able to buffer the drive rush off of the lights, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Then they
And
changed
then
it.
and they changed
They
it,
changed it.
right?
Command.
So let's talk about that for a second, right?
Mhm.
Like, so what's the difference between buffering a move and hit confirming a move?
Yeah, so great question. So for those who don't know, what is a hit confirm? What is a buffer? A hit confirm is essentially this idea of I can visually or auditorily, whatever it may be. There's a sense that I'm using in which I can tell if my opponent got hit by something or didn't get hit by something. By that distinction, my decision tree changes in what I ought to do. If I hit them, I ought to do the extension that gives you more damage or a better position. If they block them, I shouldn't do that extension, because if they blocked it, and they probably will block the extension itself, it would leave me in a position where I've lost my turn at least, or even at the worst. Or at best, it's I lose my turn. At worst, I get punished because it's a dangerous position to be in.
Yeah, let's not even talk about buffering, because that's probably more high level than we need to
Sure,
be at
sure,
right
sure,
now.
sure.
But like, so in that hit confirm, so basically what you're saying is like you get yourself to, you create this new state, right?
Mhm.
You throw out a button,
Mhm.
and you've created this new state. There's a new point in the decision tree where you have to reflect on the stimuli that you're
Yes.
basing your decisions off of,
Mhm.
right? And that could be that's whatever your perception is, right? It's like
Yeah.
whatever the cue is. I was talking about this the other day during our rapier class.
Mhm.
I used to talk about fencing as just rock paper scissors, or it's just fighting games, or just
Mhm.
I'm at the point now where it's like most of the time at the level that we play fencing at, it's really
Mhm.
just whack-a-mole. It's just whack-a-mole,
Mhm. Mm.
right?
Mhm.
The mole pops up, and where it pops up, you hit it, right? Now it's a
Right.
little bit more sophisticated. You have to hit different moles in this
Sure.
particular kind of way,
Mhm.
right? And the way that you're standing and the way that you're holding your sword is going to impact the way that
Yes.
you have to respond, right? But at the end of
Mhm.
the day, it's really just you see the cue and you respond with the correct option if you have the wherewithal, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
And so what you're talking about with hit confirming is basically like, I'm going to do a thing, and depending on what I see happen, I'm going to reflect on the new information that I've gotten, and I'm going to proceed one of two or whatever, however many different ways,
Right.
right? So, but there's a problem with that, right? And
Mhm.
the problem is, how do we get good enough where we're able to? So there's a window, right? So
Mm.
let's talk about
Mhm.
the hit confirm window.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the hit confirm window itself is generally, depending on the game, depending on the button that you press, can be big, can be small. The window could be, and if we're using frame data as an example, I'm going to really, really quickly make this really derivative and really reductive. But if we look at frames, startup, active, and then recovery, a cancel is oftentimes where we're canceling the recovery of a move into another move itself. A hit confirm is often, when we're canceling our button into a different button as part of the hit confirm process. And that usually requires some type of state change, right? Whether it's visually seeing my opponent got hit, or not seeing them get hit is the big thing. So I wanted to make that addendum. What was the first part of that question again?
Well, so we're just talking about like, so you have the hit confirm window, right? So you
Oh, yes,
have
the window. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So my bad. So let me speak on the window. The window itself means that we have like essentially a set amount of time that we can ideally make the decision, or make the positive decision based off the hit confirm. If
Mhm.
they did get hit by my button and I want to do this cancel to make the hit confirm happen, I can't wait there all day, because the game
Right.
continues moving, the time continues moving. If I don't hit them within a certain amount of time, maybe it can be as small as 4 frames. It can sometimes be as big as like 10 frames as well. I've lost my chance, right? I've hit them, but I don't get more. And
Right.
then inversely, if this pressure of having this time crunch is what makes hit confirming difficult, because one, if I can't really catch on to the timing of the hit confirm, physically, I can't do the actions fast enough to get it done. But also, you just don't have the chance to do it anymore. It adds pressure to the action
Right.
itself, and that
Yeah,
pressure
yeah.
can mean that you just don't succeed in it.
It can be super overwhelming as the person who's like trying to, like, you're trying to grasp the stimulus, you're trying to
Yeah.
perform the motion, right? And if it's a
Mhm.
motion game, like a motion input game, like it could be a complex motion, and
Yeah.
or you might need to buffer some part of the motion,
Yes.
and
Right.
so like how would you train that? And actually, before I get there, because
Mhm.
another aspect of fighting games that kind of works in tandem to this,
Mhm.
and specifically with regards to Street Fighter, linked combos, right? Function very
Yeah.
similar way,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
But I like linked combos to go into this more than hit confirm, purely than hit confirms. Well, I guess in both cases they could leave you punishable,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
So maybe, so let's say you're linking a combo and
Hmm.
you have such a frame window to hit
Hmm.
heavy punch.
Hmm.
And if you hit heavy punch or whatever the button, right, whatever your button is
Sure.
that leaves you, it might leave you negative, right? If you hit it at point blank, that might leave you so negative that you get punished,
Right.
right? But it's part of the combo.
Hmm.
So you want to hit it at point blank range because you want to get the damage so that you can
Right.
execute the combo well. But you only have a certain amount of time, and you have to like train yourself. So how do you train hit confirming? How do you train linking
Hmm.
to prevent yourself from putting yourself like in those high pressure situations in a
Hmm.
state that leaves you super vulnerable?
Yeah. So the easy answer is you get good. Yeah, you see it enough, and then you find out whether it is like, oh, I'm specifically looking for like some type of like some spark on the screen to show that I hit them. Maybe I'm looking at the counter hit like location to see if they get hit. Maybe I'm listening to the game itself and finding some auditory cue. Whatever it may be, it's predicated on one very specific important part, and that's it needs to be somewhat of a focus. It needs to be actively sought after. So I think this is a thing that I like to say pretty often when discussing fighting games. I think in fencing, it's really applicable. We only have so many mental resources we can spend on any given thing. And a fighting game is difficult because it's so many small games put together at one point in time. While
Right.
the individual games can be very, very easy and take very little mental cap, putting them together and knowing which game you ought to be playing or that you are currently playing is what takes up mental bandwidth. Even as a beginner, give a someone who's played video games, give them like a fight stick, and they're going to be like, I can't do anything because they're unfamiliar with the device. That means that their mental bandwidth, their mental cap, is taken specifically just to do anything. And then you ask them, all right, now let's look at hit confirms. If they don't even have, if they're using mental cap just to press a button,
Yeah.
the odds of them having enough mental space or mental bandwidth to do the visual or the observational, the perspective part to make the hit confirm work is probably not good. So when we
Right.
look at a newer player, usually the thing is get comfortable with the buttons and get super comfortable with the action itself. And then the second part is once you feel comfortable that you can do it 10 times in a row on both sides without looking, whatever it may be. And then at that point, really focus on the tactical position that you're put into. You're going to do the combination brain dead, but you're really looking at this one specific thing. And I think in fencing, it's pretty similar. We find these motions that are ingrained, and we're looking for very specific stimuli, whether that's a very specific blade position or fooling, whether it's some type of like setup that I get my opponent to bite on, right? It's very similar. But just like with newbies and swords, you can't really teach them that until they feel comfortable to even get there, whatever it may be.
Right. So
Mhm.
for people who follow my channel, like this is something that we talk about at great length, and I spent a lot of effort to develop a method for programming this development, right? So like
Mhm.
if we're going to use fighting games as a template for this, right? Like
Mhm.
the first thing, and this is just based on what you're saying, right? Is like I have to learn to press the button, right?
Mhm.
Um, and then maybe we're talking about like the light punish, right?
Mhm.
I have to learn to press all of these buttons that make up the light punish,
Mhm.
um, or ending up to and including special moves or whatever the motion
Sure.
inputs. So I learned those, and then I put them together, and I can't just put them together any which way. I have to put them together in a certain rhythm,
Mhm.
right? So the very first thing that we train is sequence,
Mhm.
and then the next thing that we train is rhythm, right?
Yes.
Being able to
Mhm.
perform the sequence of the techniques, of the various techniques strung together to create this,
Mhm.
like the subordinate components of the thing.
Mhm.
It was such that the timing of each of the subordinate components starts and stops where it needs to, right? In order
Absolutely.
for the thing to be coherent by itself. And
Mhm.
then after that, I have to learn to put that thing, the new thing, in
Mhm.
context, in some kind of context. So what you're describing is sort of the tactical application of hit confirming, right?
Yeah.
Now that doesn't mean that you go into a match and you say, okay, I'm practicing hit confirming right now.
Right.
It means that you go up against a training dummy, or
Yeah.
bug
You
you
do
bug
you do
your buddy
random
Brandon,
block, whatever it may. Yeah. For
right? And
whatever
you say
reason.
like, hey Brandon, help me hit confirm train today.
Yeah.
You're like, okay, got it. I will
Yeah.
match jab or hold
Yeah.
block, right? Like,
Mhm.
um, and then I'm gonna take that new skill, and first I'm just gonna do it against the dummy, but then eventually I'm gonna have to do it against the decision, right?
Yeah.
So it's like recognizing the stimulus and then saying, okay, this is the correct choice to make given what I just saw.
Hmm.
And often when we're training, we don't even say, like, we don't even go for execution right away, right? So it's
Right.
just like you perform the initial action, and then observe the stimulus, and then just say it out loud, right? Like say
Hmm.
what you've seen out loud, right?
Hmm.
Strong parry, right? Hang and
Hmm.
parry,
Hmm.
crom, whatever your training partner does, and then you say, okay, what do you do when he moves to crom? You unter to the hands, right?
Hmm.
What do you do when he strong pairs? You zucken. What
Hmm.
do you do when he hang in pairs? You meet turn, or you tag to the hands, depending on where the distance is. And you
Hmm.
develop that, but you limit the context. So you don't, this isn't in a match, right? Because in a match, you've got, Cammy doing aerial assaults.
Sure. Whatever. Maybe.
right. So
Hmm.
like that's, and random spiral arrows across
Yeah.
the EX spiral arrows across the screen.
Absolutely.
So like, you do that until, again, you can do it 10 times on both sides,
Yeah.
right? And then once you get there, then you can, here's one thing that's different about fencing and fighting games, is
Hmm.
that the rhythm of fighting games is set, right? The walk
Right.
speed is when it's a digital switch, right?
Yep.
The walk speed is what it is. If he's pressing forward, the character's going to move this distance. The
Right.
frame data is what it is. And for fencing, there's a sort of extra level of depth where
Hmm.
the move speed, right? The amount of time across space can change radically.
Hmm.
Um, and we can get into accounting for that later, right?
Hmm.
But what we generally do after someone's figured out the context part, like, so they can observe the stimulus and then make the correct decision,
Yeah.
and then actually perform it correctly, then we start messing with your intensity. So my training partner's intensity.
Hmm.
So I have to, you're going to change the window of time that I have to execute my action.
Right. Hmm.
Because you can move fast, because your frame data changes.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but again, all of that is sort of like ingrained certainly within our school, and like what we talked about on the YouTube channel. And it's interesting that you basically outlined it like yourself, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
this is the only way that you can get good at things, is that you have to start
Yes.
by doing it, and
Yes.
then do it in rhythm, and then make the choice, and then do it at the right space and time given the external conditions.
Exactly,
Right.
yeah. And I think that it gets to a position where, so, contextually speaking, we really want to make everything as simple as possible, right? The more that we can simplify the game itself, like you said, if they strong parry, Zucken, Duplaren, whatever it may be, or Durfresh, whatever it may be, if they, they do a hanging parry, Mutir, and attack the hands, we break these down to really small tactical pockets of like, oh, when they do this, do this. But the hard part of fencing, just like the hard part in fighting games, is hey, I drilled out they do a hanging parry, I do a mutir, and I feel comfortable when I have that drill in front of me. But it's hard to see it when it's actually moving, or it's hard to get there. And just
Yeah.
like everybody's, a lot of people's beginning perceptions of a fighting game is, I don't want to learn a game just to learn how to do combos and I always do the same combo. It's not that. It's never like that, right? It's like you do a combo and you'll probably never get the opportunity to ever do it, especially if you don't know how to get there, right?
Right.
The hard part, and kind of in my opinion, part of the mastery of being good at fighting games is not just being good at the individual games themselves, but being very, very transparent about what game you're trying to play, what game your opponent's trying to play, or how to get to the game that you want. Some characters do
Right.
it better. Let's say somebody like Dalsum has a really easy game plan, keep them out, right? And so
Yeah.
that's a game they need to play. And that's very different if they play against Zangief, a character who's slow, who has to work his way in, versus a
Mhm.
character like Cammy or Blanca, who can hit you, knock you down, and then it's game over. So
Right.
the tactical decisions, the things that you want to do, and even the games that you can access change very drastically based off of even the pursuit of it. And I
Right.
think with fencing, what ends up happening is everybody knows, oh, I can just like, what's a counter to a tware? I'm going to do another tware. I'm going to do like an inter tware to get underneath it
Right.
for this one tempo pair or post situation. And you can drill it out. That's good. That's fine. But can you spot it?
Right.
Can you visually find a position when you're fencing that you can read it in the next exchange?
Or
That's
or or
Mhm.
but like what you started with is like, can you create conditions where that's what you can
Yeah.
expect?
Absolutely.
right? So
Absolutely.
like so now this will be the last topic, and then we'll break from this, and we'll
Sure.
revisit, because this is I'm totally digging this. So
Cool.
as long
No,
as you're
me
game,
too.
we'll do
Yeah,
more
for
of
sure.
this. But
Absolutely.
so okay, so you got your noob, and you're like, all right, learn your
Mhm.
anti-airs, and he's like, I got it, and you're like, okay, you jump in, and he's anti-airing everything, and you play sweep and
Yeah.
throw, and he's got the meta, right? And then you do
Mhm.
some like you do daily footsie, 5 minutes of footsies every day, where you just whiff punishing and buffering specials, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then you say, all right, young Padawan, go be free, go into ranked.
Go fight in the streets in
Go
ranked. Good luck. Good luck. Yeah.
and Blanca does Blanca ball, and Honda does a
Does
thousand
100
hand
hands
slap,
100
or
times.
whatever he
Yeah.
does. And they come back to you, and they're like, this game
Like this, I
sucks,
learned
and you
nothing.
suck.
Yeah. Like
Like,
you didn't get me ready for
so
anything. Yeah.
what do you do, right? And that's those are actually bad examples, because like my generally speaking, the way that these games are supposed to be designed is that
Sure.
stuff is unsafe, right?
Yeah.
Like,
It's a knowledge check, what we'd call it internally. It's a
yeah.
knowledge
Let's
check.
not think
Mhm.
about knowledge checks. Let's think that
Right.
if someone is constantly throwing bullshit at you,
Yeah.
you should be able to block it, right? But like, what do
Right.
you do for your footsies player? He's like, no one wants to play footsies. Everyone's just, every time I try and play footsies, it's just invincible reversal.
Right.
Like, what do you do? What
So
do you tell them?
so it's this fixation of the game. So when we teach people how to play, right, of course we teach them this is footsies, and maybe you play with your friend, and you, being a good fighting game player, you want to play footsies because that's what's fun. So they want to play footsies because that's the training they get with you, and that's what you're both good at, right? But then they play with somebody, and then they want to play footsies, they're shimmying back and forth, and they just get jumped in on, and they get thrown, and they can never play footsies that entire round again. And they're like, man, like what went wrong? Let's say this person hypothetically knew how to anti-air perfectly fine, right? So where does the difficulty come in? The difficulty is in, again, the mental bandwidth. They want to play footsies and they know how to anti-air. So they're like, oh, I can just keep them here. But if you're the other player, how do you beat that? You make it feel like you're playing footsie, so they're focused on the ground game, and then you jump in because they've lost the plot. They're not mentally sharp enough to maybe get to that position, right?
Yeah.
So for me, when I find people, or I've seen, I'm on Discord with my friends, I'm watching them get absolutely torn up by some Blanca player, by everything that's unsafe, and they're so busy trying to do something that sometimes the answer is like, if you just blocked and just like watch what they're doing, you could probably find the answer because you know the answer. It's just you're so mixed up or emotionally charged, or you're
Yeah.
just so mind boggled by what's happening. Again, these are kind of the not really what this isn't what they tell you in a fighting game tutorial. They don't tell you to, hey, beat footsies by putting pressure, and then mentally
Right.
they're going to be a bit scrambled. The game can give you really hard answers and really hard rules, but really the expression of the fighting game, the difficulty of the fighting game, is the meta in between, right? And this is where we can get into things that are like, well, what's technically right? You know what I mean? Like jumping in
Right.
is really, really punishable, but there's a time where you kind of have to do it if they're really much better than you at footsies, right? Because it's
Right.
going to break the expectation.
Or if just like there's a game theory thing about like you need to jump in 1 out of 8 times, because
Just show them that you're willing to do it. Yeah, whatever it
yeah,
may be.
exactly, right, whatever it may be,
Mhm.
because they have to honor that, and then what you're doing is you're saying, no, you can't focus all of your attention to this footsies game, which if you did, you would be better than me at it, right?
Right.
Is that instead you have to reserve some of your bandwidth for paying attention to the other thing that's going on. But
Exactly.
going back to our like noob, like out like on and ranked for the first time out in
Yeah.
the wild, it's like, don't maybe the first rule is like, I've given you the tools to take your turn when it's your turn, right?
Mhm.
And most of that involves just blocking shit that's unsafe, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
then and like walk forward and block, right? That's like the first thing that someone who like that's the first thing that you hear if you're being told like, all right, you want to get good at fighting games, this is the first thing that you need to do.
Right.
I've shown you
Mhm.
how. Walk forward and block, right?
Mhm.
And then when you're in range, then start throwing out your buttons.
Right.
But as you're walking forward, you're paying attention. What is the game that my training partner is trying to play?
Right.
Right?
Mhm.
Like, and I have to be careful for all of the variety of options that they have. And if they're looking to jump in, and if I get a sense that that's their game plan, well, then okay, then you get to focus your attention on it, and then all of a sudden you have a high chance of success, right? If the person is playing a super like basic,
Sure. Some way
operating.
that they're able to read it, whatever it may be.
Right. Basically, without adaptation,
Mhm.
and I think that's sort of like, for me, when I think about fencing,
Mhm.
I don't really regard it as fencing until there's adaptation, right?
Yeah.
For
Right.
personally, right? It's
Sure.
like I don't. It's only interaction when my behavior now has an impact on your future choices,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
If my behavior now has zero impact on your future choices, right? If you're either going to
Yeah.
operate according to your game plan, or you're just going to be random, right? Like
Yeah.
those are the basically the two other options.
Yeah.
Then I'm going to observe. Like my focus then becomes observe your game plan and,
Right. Right. Right.
respond in a way that leaves me the least vulnerable.
Right, I agree, and it's almost like you're playing against a bot at that point, right? Somebody's just, and you see this all the time with newer people, or you maybe will watch really low level gameplay, and it's just one person jumping at somebody, getting anti-aired, and then immediately jumping again, and then getting anti-aired, and
Yeah.
it's like you can argue you're not really even playing a game, you're almost
Well,
you're a
yeah,
simulator
right.
watching them.
Well, you're playing whack-a-mole, right? But
Yeah, it is for
there's a
sure.
sense in which it's all whack-a-mole, right?
Right,
It's like,
right, right. It's a
it's
really,
just
really easy version of the game that you need to play. I think that
yeah.
ideally, and I think this goes into what reads, the idea of reads being this great equalizer or this expression of skill in a player, right? I'm sure that in your fighting game career, you've reached this point where you have a sense when you're playing footsies, they're going to jump. I can feel it. I can smell
Yeah.
it. There's no like real visual tell because it's not like the character is like squatting down getting ready, but
This
by
is
the
my
player, you just
th-
know. You know what I
so
mean?
I enter into a debate with a couple of fencers,
Hmm.
friends of mine, that we talk about sort of with regards to the HEMA project,
Mm,
whether or not the master's thought, or whether or not we should conceive of fencing as having some purest form, some platonic
mm,
ultimate form,
hmm.
right? And there is a difference between fencing, because I can always hide behind my sword in fencing,
Hmm.
uh, and I can always pull distance, and so I theoretically can operate in a way that's perfect, right?
Hmm.
Um, but the truth is, it's the exact same as with fighting games. If I'm operating perfectly and my opponent's operating perfectly, then we're gonna fence, and then when it's over, neither of us are gonna have any points, right?
Right. Hmm.
So the question has to become: at what point am I willing to accept risk? At what point am I willing to leave myself in a position that's nominally negative,
Hmm.
right? But because I can anticipate your response, I can get plus, right?
Yeah,
Like, so
for
for
sure.
instance, if I cut into your strong parry, I
Hmm.
perceive that you're playing a taker game, and that
Hmm.
you're not going to allow yourself into distance unless you're strong and have an opportunity to retake your offense.
Hmm.
So I might provoke you to retake your offense by cutting into your strong parry, and
Hmm.
knowing that you're going to thrust, and then be prepared for a hanging parry. Now, typically a hanging parry is negative to a thrust. If you begin your thrust, you're strong and you begin your thrust, and I
Hmm.
move to hanging parry, then theoretically you should be able to work into as my hanging parry,
Yep.
right?
Absolutely. Hmm.
But if instead of hanging, maybe if I snap the blade, or snap it down, or snap it up into cron, and then immediately take a lower opening,
Hmm.
I was able to do that because I anticipated the thrust. So I actually, because I was more aware of what your options were, I could start my action earlier than using
Exactly.
fewer.
You can buffer it. Whiff punishing, buffer a super for a big punish. It's the same
Right,
thing.
right,
Absolutely.
exactly. So like, the question is, at what point, like, you get to a point where, like, all right, we're playing perfectly, we know the
Hmm.
frame data of all the moves, we know the
Right.
blade configurations and whose turn it is, but then we get to another level when we can start to anticipate what our training partner is going to do, and we can
Hmm.
buffer in our responses to those, and
Yeah.
now all of a sudden we're not fencing, or rather, we're not, the game isn't what we're doing with our swords.
Right.
The game is who is better at
Yes,
perceiving what the
for
opponent's
sure.
response is going to be.
And I think that's what makes, the path of being a good fighting game player is, again, we have these little games and we can play the games, individually, subjectively, but it's until we understand how holistically it's put together, until I can make a read about when the game's about to switch, that I can put things together. And like you said, it's a mindset thing. My new, not my new favorite, but a position that's been held for better or for worse by a lot of fighting game online purists. Negative is a state of mind. Being negative, it's a state of mind. The math, who cares about the math? I didn't pay $60 a block. I pay, I want to go in. But
Right.
there is a reality to, I think of, Bison Street Fighter Five, who almost every button he was plus on. There's a really funny Twitter clip of like, yeah, play correctly, and it's just a clip of somebody stuck in a block string taking 80% HP on block because
Yeah.
everything is plus. But the reality is, like, there's a mental proponent that solves the issue, and it's the risk itself, or it's the read. The read to make the better payoff, the read
Right.
to make the negative position that you're into a positive position, whatever it may
Right.
be, for sure.
Right. Now, again, with fencing, the motion inputs are a little bit more complex, right?
Right,
And
sure.
so maybe we have to spend like a lot more time. Maybe our entire career
Mhm.
might be just developing the physical competencies to be able to perform these buttons
Yes,
in a
sure.
way where you could actually use them in the game.
Right,
And
right,
then we
right.
don't get to spend any time like learning how to play the game more effectively or learning how to read our training partners or whatever
I think
because we're
that's a hard part, and I've made this. I think there's a fair critique to have is we can look to HEMA as this maybe this way to recreate or marry imagery with motion. Whether it's like I look at the images in a plate and I'm like, oh, this is how I should be, or this is how the masters assume that I should be. And we can maybe talk about how we look at early KDF and oppose that to maybe Myers 1570. There is like uh, there's a difference in pedagogy and how they talk about movement, and maybe something is a bit more beneficial or a bit more accessible for us as 21st century
Mhm.
individuals. All that may be true, and there was a lot of fixation on which one's better, but there isn't a lot of about the meat, like this idea of like tactically you have the motions down, but how do we put it all together? There's a few things, right? We can talk about like provoker, taker, hitter as a framework, zoo affecting pre-action.
You could infer stuff, right? Like you
Yeah,
have to, but it's a project. Like a lot of
yeah,
trying to understand the
absolutely.
depth. It's sort of, and we do have to go now because I'm going to go teach wrestling after this.
Sure, 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 sure.
But it reminds me of what HEMA reminds me of is the first people that ever played Street Fighter, right?
Yeah.
Like the first people who ever got good at
Sure.
it, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah.
there were the developers didn't even know what the frame did. Like
Right,
they,
absolutely. We didn't really even get to know about it until like Street Fighter 4 when it was still the Wild Wild West. Or even like to
right,
your point, it's like, back in the day, so I wasn't around for the arcade times, but I've heard plenty of stories. Uh, Getting thrown in Street Fighter 2, don't throw people. It's bad
right, because it's
manners.
bad. Yeah, it's bad manners. It's bad etiquette. You
Or
should cheat.
in Tekken, if people are playing a Mishima, if you duck an electric wind god fist, you can't punish it. Even ducking it is like it's really ill mannered. But I think of Hema, don't hit each other in the hands because it's not martial, right? Or
Right,
don't
right.
do
Well,
these
yeah,
one handed actions. We make these funny
it,
little rules. You know what I mean?
it's because we got it. We got to
No, it's
stop. We can
okay.
talk
We can
about it.
save it for another
All right.
time. But yeah,
So thank you, Brandon. That was freaking awesome
yeah,
as
for sure,
per usual, and look forward to continuing this at a later date. And thanks everybody
absolutely.
for joining us for this stream. Take care.
Mhm.